a brief overview of the pattern and the paper of slot 2, and then we will look at each section in a little more detail and the pattern and the nature of questions. And we'll also look at the overall analysis of the paper and the overall cutoffs that we can expect. And we will also compare it briefly towards the end with how the morning slot went. So let's just see the overall pattern. The VA-RC section had the usual 16 questions in RC, and the VA part had 8 questions and only 2 non-MCQs this time in the VA-RC section. The DALR had 22 questions and around 10 non-MCQs, and QA had 22 questions. So the change here, as many of you might have heard or already have experienced and written the exam, is that there were 2 more questions in DLR than the usual pattern, than what was being followed for over 3 years. The CAT has changed slightly, and we will look at what the implications of this change were. So here we have the overview of what transpired. There were minimal reports of difficulties faced in terms of the actual conduct of the exam in the exam centers. So it's very streamlined, as we know. And we also see that the pattern was 68 questions, as I explained earlier, with 24 in VRC, 22 in DLR, and 22 in QA. And this change, some of you who have looked at the demo test before taking the CAT, the students would have got a hint that maybe there may be a change in the pattern, but there were disclaimers saying that the demo test should not be taken as a pattern to be expected, but it did come through that DA had 22 questions and the total was 68. So let's now look at the VARC section. The VARC section didn't have too much of a change when compared to last year. And there were 4 RC passages, each having 4 questions. And we'll look at the nature of the passages a little later. But yeah, there were no non-MCQ questions in the RC. And as is expected, the VA questions, there were 8 of them. And there were 3 types of questions. And this time, para jumbles seem to have been sent packing, and only para summary questions, sentence placement questions were there, and odd one out type of questions were there. And as far as the non-MCQs goes, it was only the odd one out questions that had 5 statements, and only they needed the input box or the non-MCQ. And the other VA questions all were just simply MCQ with just 4 choices. And here we will look at the passage-wise understanding of the reading comprehension section. And here one passage was on the importance of spices and how the desire or the demand for spices changed the history and a lot of issues in the medieval world, especially. So the topic was quite difficult to read because the nature of the text was a little inference-based, and it was not very easy. And the readability was moderate to difficult. But the wordings in the questions, particularly in this passage, there were 4 questions, they were quite complicated. And this is what made this passage quite challenging to attempt, actually. And that was seen overall in the slot, that the moderate difficulty of reading did not translate into overall moderate difficulty. Instead, the questions or the wording of the questions or the closeness of the choices, they made the passages a little more difficult. So let's look at the second passage. It was on peer review of articles, scientific articles. And here the readability was moderate to difficult. And the difficulty level of the passage overall also was moderate to difficult. And a lot of questions in this passage were critical reasoning intensive. So as in the text had to be read in between the lines many times. So the passage was also a little more difficult than the spices passage. And then there was a passage, the third one, on carnivore and human interactions, about how increasing interaction between wild animals and humans who feed them or go and settle near their wild habitats. So what's the effect of this? So there was a very interesting read, and it was not tough to read. So moderate difficulty in terms of readability, but the overall difficulty became difficult, as I explained earlier, because every question had close choices. And there were some questions where they seemed to be inference based, but the choices were very close. And then there were some detail based questions also. And everywhere it was a challenge because the wordings of the questions were twisted with double negatives. And that would have really confused many students, because even though you understood the passage, the question was making it very complex to follow what each choice was telling. So there would be statements like, which of the following statements, if false, would not be inconsistent with the passage? So that if false and not inconsistent, that's can send your head spinning, and it can take up a little more time while you try to answer the passages and the questions. Uh, then other difficulty level was that there were several questions where the choices could be said to have been, at least two choices could have been said to be close. They could have eaten up your time while you keep pondering over which one is really better. Even though you eliminated two choices, those two choices left would have eaten up your time if you hadn't been decisive. Now, that is something that would have set apart those who do very well versus those who sort of end up spoiling their strategy or their time management because of brooding over some close choices. Now, that is where what sets apart the ones who perform. And then there was a fourth passage on externalities of inventions. Now, this passage was pretty easy to read, and overall also could be said to have been moderate difficulty level, but it had some elements of critical reasoning involved. So overall, these passages were on par with last year's CAT, if you have an idea. Now, let's look at the verbal ability part. The sentence placement questions were quite easy to read, and they were at most moderate in terms of difficulty, you could say. But in fact, there were some questions where students said that the answers just stood out, and that was easy. So that sentence placement was probably a breeze for several students. Now, that wasn't the case for para summaries, because para summaries, it seems, were challenging, and there was a lot of condensation that was expected from the student. Like, the questions were lengthy to read, the paragraph given was complex and ran into several lines, but the choices really pushed the students' understanding by being very concise. Now, that is where students were probably tested on, and the choices seemed very close. So they were moderate to difficult overall, and the odd one out, there were two of them, and these questions were actually pretty challenging. And these questions needed to be like the time needed was more. And even if you'd spent a lot of time, you wouldn't have been able to identify with confidence, because there was a lack of connectives. There was lack of the flow of thought in these odd one out questions. And as a result, the student would have been pretty stuck up in terms of identifying which one is exactly the odd one out. So these could be classified as very difficult. And overall, the difficulty level of this section was moderate to difficult. And there were 3 passages and 6 questions. This is what a decent number of attempts would have been for a student who's targeting a decent percentile. So it's not that you could have attempted all of them comfortably, but minimum 3 passages and 6 or more questions of VA should have been a fairly good attempt. And not losing time on questions with close answer choices, as I just mentioned, that would have made all the difference in this kind of a paper. And a small point to note here is that usually for quite a few years, the VA-RC questions were segregated. And RC used to be first with 4 passages, one after the other, and then the 8 VA-RC questions used to appear. But this time they chose to intersperse the VA questions amidst the RC passages. And that could have actually interfered or sort of held up some students in terms of their strategy and time management, because some are very clear that they want to do RC first and then go to VA. So after every passage, you stumble across a few VA questions, it would have either distracted you or put you off. So all you had to do was hold your mind and not get a little unnerved by those unexpected interruptions. And you should have ignored those VA if you thought all VA had to be attempted later. And it would have been tough for you to switch between RC mode and VA mode if you didn't ignore the VA in the middle. You would have felt a little bit of a jarring effect on your strategy. So let's hope that you did it well and did not face too much of a problem in terms of this reorganization of questions. Now let's look at the estimated cutoffs. And our first cut at time, we have estimated that an 85 percentile in this section would need about 19 to 21 marks. And that's just about 9 attempts with decent accuracy, maybe 1 or 2 mistakes. 2 mistakes probably you could make on them. So you should be crossing 85 percentile. And 95 percentile would need more attempts, about 12 or more attempts with a good accuracy. That's about 28 to 30 marks. And a 99 percentile score would have been 37 to 39 marks. This is what we expect as from our expert analysis of whatever we have understood. That's about 16 attempts with good accuracy. So that would put you up right up there with 99s, and that's what the IIMs really look for. Some of the IIMs really have very high cutoffs. So we hope everyone did their best in this section. Let's now look at the second section, which is the DI-LR section. And here, as you all know, we mentioned at the beginning of the analysis that the demo test gave a heads up that there may be a change in the number of questions, total number of questions, and that's what exactly happened. The DI section in the demo test had 22 questions, and instead of the usual 20 over the last 3 years, this is exactly what came in the actual CAT today. And the only difference was that there were 5 sets instead of 4 sets. And these 5 sets were 2 sets of 5 questions each and 3 sets of 4 questions each. Now that if you compare with last year, we had 4 sets of 5 questions each. So here there is one more set to look at, and this would have definitely had an impact on your strategy. And let's just look at these 5 sets and understand what the students would have gone through and what would have been a good strategy here. There was a set on a grid of numbers, but just about 10 numbers were given from 1 to 10, and they needed to be arranged in the grid based on some conditions. This set had 5 questions, and it was quite difficult. It could be rated because particularly students said that none of the conditions given in that reasoning question helped us to start solving that set. So it was like you didn't know where to start from. It was a little challenging. So this is a tough set with 5 questions. And then we have another set on streets and lakes inside a township. It was a rectangular grid of streets, and you had to move around on that along the streets, and what's the minimum distance or the maximum distance people can cover. So that kind of question, it was moderate to difficult. In fact, it was probably one of the more doable sets in this paper today. But it didn't look like that. It looked like a diagram with some lakes that are shaded in the screen and the grid of roads. So students should have been a little more confident and brave to go through the questions and read them a little before judging whether it was too difficult or looked too strange to delve into. So let's now look at the third set that was on athletes and coaches. This was a distribution kind of set, a standard LR kind of a set. It was again moderate to difficult. In this set, if you could just solve as a normal reasoning set on distribution, you could have proceeded a little way through the solution apparently, but there was some conditions there which needed really a lot of cases. The students said that at that point they tend to get stuck, and that is where probably students might have faced a big difficulty. But the feedback is that some questions could have been solved even with a partial way through the solution. You could have answered a few questions. So maybe if you were very alert, you could have answered those couple of questions and moved out of the set. Then let's look at the next set, which was on a ratings of a store. It had a small bar chart followed by some pieces of information. But this was a DI set, but a lot of reasoning was involved, quant-based reasoning, and it had 4 questions in it. And this set was a difficult set because it had a lot of data which had to be filled up in a grid. And how do you fill up the grid? There were some statements given, and some of the statements had statistical terminology in them, like mode. And then the questions, one of the questions had the term median. So that would have made it this set a little difficult or scary for people. And also there were some other quant concepts that had to be applied. Something like special equations had to be applied to solve this set. So while the calculations were not tough, but that thinking, the quant-based thinking would have helped you through the set. Then there is a set on profit of companies, profit after tax, number of employees. So this was a bubble chart, and this had 4 questions on it. And this set looks scary or intimidating because of the nature of the charts. There were several companies and there were several bubbles there, and there were 2 charts, and to look up these charts to understand what they mean, students would have been really a little intimidated by the data, and that is what would have made this set difficult. Also, it was challenging because the students said that they had to read through the data and write it down on the paper to be able to answer the questions. Most of the questions needed that you analyze the data. I mean, it was not like you could just look at the chart and answer it. So that was also a tougher paper, tougher set, I mean. Then overall, the difficulty level of the section was difficult, but there were definitely a mix of moderate and difficult sets. Now, this you can compare and contrast with last year. There were only 4 sets and they were mostly challenging. That would have made it very difficult for the students to decide on which sets to pick. Here, this year, with 5 sets, there were some sets which could have been easily identified as easier or doable. But again, a little bit of open mind is what would have been very, very helpful, because as I said, some sets look tougher, but they were not really tougher. The set on the networks and the roots. So overall, it was much easier than last year's DI section. And basically, because of the choice, you had 5 sets, and maybe for a good performance, you could happily just ignore 1 set, which was the toughest, and then focus on the other 4. Even if you attempted 3 sets, maybe you would with good accuracy, you would be in a good standing. But for anyone aiming for the top B schools, 4 sets would have been a must here. So let's look at the estimated cutoffs. And as per our time expert estimates, the 85 percentile in this section would have been around 16 to 18 marks. That's about 7 questions. This minimum would have covered two sets. And in these 2 sets, you can reach this cutoff percentile for some of the IIMs, but that's not what the other, some of the other IIMs look at. They look at higher percentiles, and a 95 would have needed 22 to 24 marks. And that would mean 10 attempts at least. So you are looking at minimum 3 sets probably. Without touching 3 sets, this 95 would have been a tough ask. And then let's talk of 99 percentile, and that's around 14 questions, which means you would have had to just at least touch a 4th set, maybe 2-3 questions in that. So around 14-15 attempts, again with good accuracy. So this overall paper was definitely tough. And so the DI section would have been something which students probably were a little either completely happy with this DI section, or it would have upset them. But hopefully that shouldn't have affected the 3rd section, the QA section. That is what we are going to look at now. So in the QA section, the number of questions remained unchanged, as we said, and the number of non-MCQs were around 8. And the area distribution this year had a slight change over last year. Last year, it was the questions looked a little algebra intensive, the proportion or the emphasis. But this year, the emphasis is back on arithmetic, which is typically known of what CAT does. So 12 questions about it seems were on arithmetic, and around just 6 on algebra, 3 on geometry, and 1 on modern math. So some topics, obviously, sometimes in some years they do not are not covered. So, but what were covered this year? Let's look at ERPV, which is our equations, ratio, proportion, variation. There were 3 questions on it, which is a solid. Most of them were on the moderate side and too easy. There was averages, mixtures and allegations, 2 questions. In geometry, 2. Interestingly, in geometry, there were no mensuration or 3D questions. There were just 2D questions. The numbers questions that were usually a couple of them were moderate. Then quadratic equations, 2 questions, coordinate geometry 1, and time and work 1 PPL. And as you can see, several topics were covered. I mean, there was a good variation in terms of the topics. One question on each of these: time and distance, logarithms, progressions, permutations and combinations too. Indices, logs, inside surds, functions, inequalities. So this is the kind of mix of questions that came. And if you look at the contents of the questions, as I said, there was more emphasis on arithmetic. And there were topics that did not make an appearance. Like this year, there were no questions on graphs or Venn diagrams, number systems, then trigonometry, and sets and relations, and even probability. So there were no questions on these topics, but that doesn't mean much. We should not read much into it. Next year, these may be there and the other topics may not make an appearance. So we have to be prepared with all the topics and as well as possible. So the interesting concepts in questions, now that is something which students have given feedback. They said that while some questions, a handful of questions were very easy, there were several questions which needed application. So some questions were formula based, but most questions, they were the interesting ones, we could say. They needed a deeper understanding of the little bit of the nuts and bolts of the concepts that you are dealing with. And that would have helped you apply the concept. So the question would have been dealing with an elementary concept, but the way it was presented, which again is a hallmark of the way the CAT frames its questions, the way the application of the topic was there, that would have tested the moderate student versus the good student. So this is what we mean by those interesting concepts in questions. And of course, there were a fair share of tougher questions also. So overall, there were a little more doable questions than last year. Last year, quant was a very tough section. The students really came out of the exam hall with sad faces and felt so miserable for their performance. This year, the number of questions within the reach of an average student would have been slightly on the higher side. So 2-3 questions more they could have probably looked at, and they wouldn't have felt so intimidated, especially because the algebra content or the complexity of the questions was relatively less. The arithmetic was emphasized more. That would have given it a easy feel, at least, we would say. But cutoffs may not change too much because the questions which needed deeper application, those were the questions that could have wasted many people's time. Many students could have got stuck in some of the questions which could have been called time traps, literally. So that you should have been careful. And even if you invested a minute and realized that it was going to eat up your time, the main thing you should have done there was to leave the question and move on to the next question. So sometimes there were questions which ran into complex equations or calculations. So it should have been a very prompt and alert approach you should have had to your strategy. So the cutoffs for this paper, we estimate it to be around 85 percentile at 13 to 15 marks. So that's just about 6 questions with good accuracy. Then 95 percentile, as I said, this is needed for looking into the good IIMs and top B schools. So 22 to 24 marks. And those who want to excel, the 99 percentiles should have looked at 32 to 34 marks. That's about 14 attempts with decent accuracy again. So that was a QA analysis. And now let's just see what we can comment about the overall afternoon slot. If we look at last year, we can say at least 2 sections were a little easier or not perceivably easier than last year. That is the DILR section and QA. And overall, the number of attempts would have been slightly higher than last year because, as we said, definitely there were more doable questions this time, both in DI or quant, you would say. English was comparable, but that still would have left us with more attempts overall. And students would have felt this coming out, and this is what they have been sharing as feedback. But one thing which students should remember and was the key today was to a better performance was to have an open mind while you select your questions. There were questions that looked complicated, but all they needed was a minute of brave time or venturing into them. And all you would have realized was that they were actually the more doable sets. So this kind of open mind is what would have made a big difference for most students. So What would the overall cutoffs look like for this slot, the afternoon slot? About 53 to 55 marks overall, the raw scores we are talking about, because there is going to be scaling, but we'll not get into that because each slot students can discuss or relate to their marks. So about 53 to 55 net marks in overall here can fetch you a 90 percentile as far as your overall percentiles are considered. And 95 percentile would be about 65 to 68 marks. That's about 28 attempts across sections with good accuracy again. And an overall 99 would need you about 90 marks, 87 to 90 marks. So that's about 36 attempts again with good accuracy. So this was the nature of today's slot 2. And if you were to compare this with slot 1, we have seen that the QA and VRC sections are slightly just a notch or just a bit tougher than the morning slot. This is the feedback that we received from students. And when we look into a much more detail, it could change a little, but on the face of it, Q and RC seem to be slightly tougher. And DILR was probably on par, but interestingly, students share that there was one set which was probably more doable, relatively more doable, and it stood out in the morning slot. So this could have made it more easy. But even then, the other sets in slot 1, morning slot, seem to have compensated for that relatively easier set. So DI overall has come to the same level on from slot 1 to slot 2. But QARC a notch easier. So if we just put down the cutoffs for a quick look so that we compare, VARC morning slot was about 21 we predicted, and at afternoon slot we're predicting 20 around. These are the middle numbers, but as we said, it's just a range we would rather stick to. So that's 21 in morning slot means could be anywhere plus or minus 1 marks. So let's look at DILR. Morning slot estimates by time are 17, and afternoon slot also, we believe that's very close in terms of the cutoff or the 85 percentile mark. QA, as we said, was a notch tougher again, 16 in the morning slot and 14 in the evening slot. So this will give you a good idea, we hope, and we really hope that you have done a good job of your exam and you are very anxious, so you can hold on, and we at Time are going to be with you, hold your hand, and give you a lot of other inputs. Just keep looking out. Thank you. Thank you.